So today's video is a little different from our usual review videos because today I'm actually going to write on the real piece of paper. So this way I can show you our calculator techniques that we can use for a lot of the questions that you have on this test. So the first unit that we are going to go over was the transformation rule. So in unit 4, the first piece that we talked about was something called transformations. So transformations means that we start with a parent function. So my parent function, f of x, which is the same as y equals, and then the letter x. So in the parent function, it had a slope of 1 because that's a 1x, and it had a y-intercept of 0 because there was no number in the back. So in our parent function, we had f of x, which is the same as y equals 1x plus 0. So now what's going to happen is we are going to take this parent function and we are going to change it by changing either the slope or the y-intercept. So what you need to know is if there is a number in front of the x, if they put a number in front of the x, for example, if they say that we're changing this to a 2x, that means that we are changing the slope. And when we change the slope, because before the slope was a 1x, and now the slope is a 2x, so when we change the slope, what happens, I'm going to zoom this in a little bit. There we go. What happens is that my line can become steeper. So if this number becomes bigger, so it was a 1x, now it's a 2x. If that number is bigger, then my graph becomes steeper. So it was a 1x, and now it is a 2x. The number is in front of the x, so that's a slope number. So this line becomes steeper, like a hill. If you were climbing up a hill, it would be a really, really steep hill. So the bigger the number, when the number gets bigger, my slope becomes steeper. So now if that number was like 1/2 x, so if it was a 1/2 x, again, it's still affecting my slope, but this time that number got smaller. So if the number becomes smaller, we call that less steep. Less steep. That means my hill is now less steep, flatter, less steep. So that is what happens when we change a number in front of the x. So when we change a number in front of the x, if that number gets bigger, it becomes steeper. That's a slope. If that number gets smaller in front of the x, number gets smaller, it becomes less steep. So that's what happens when we have things that affect the x value. Let's go like this. Okay, so if we have a change in front of the x, it's changing the slope. When your slope changes, it gets steeper or less steep. So now if we have a plus or a minus with no x, so just a plus or a minus, the number in the back is called the y-intercept. So the number in the back was the y-intercept. What a y-intercept does is it moves our graph up or down. Very easy. So for example, if it said plus 4 in the back, it means it would move up 4. If it was a minus 3 in the back, it means it would move down 3. Okay, so those are the two changes that can happen. We can either change the slope by putting a number in front of the x, or we can change the y-intercept and move it up or down by putting a plus or a minus sign in the back with no x. So go ahead and write those notes down to make this page much easier. So we're going to start with question number 1. So in question number 1, it says Maria graphed f of x equals x. That's just our parent function. We know our parent function. Then she graphs g of x, which means it's a new function, which is our original function, plus 6. So go ahead and circle the phrase plus 6. So if we look at our rules, plus 6 is a number being added to the back. So that means that this thing is going to move up or down. Because it's positive, it means my graph shifts, that just means it moves, shifts up 6. Very easy. So that's your answer to number 1. We had an original graph, was the parent function. We change it, a plus 6 in the back literally just means we go up 6. So go ahead and try the same thing with number 2. So number 2, we have the parent function, but this time they're taking that function and they're dropping it down to minus 2. All right, number 3. Number 3, same idea. Brenda graphed f of x equals x. That's just the parent function. That's just y equals 1x plus 0. That's not hard. It says that she takes that original graph and she changes it. Instead of x, now it is 4x. So when there's a number with your x, that is a slope. Anytime there's a number in front of the x, that's the slope. So we go to our slope rules. If that number got bigger, it became steeper. So it was a 1x, and now it's a 4x. So this graph became steeper. You could graph it on a coordinate plane, and you would see that the slope got bigger, so it became steeper. It's a steeper line. So try the same thing with number 4. So it's either steeper or it's less steep. Very easy. So number 5. In number 5, it says, describe the change of f of x equals x. Oh, look, again, that is our parent function. It says when the slope of the original line is changed to a 1/2 and the y-intercept changes to a 6. So in this one, we've got 2 things that's changing. It says the slope. So a slope is the number in front of the x. The slope just changed to a 1/2. The y-intercept is the number in the back. My y-intercept is a plus 6. Y-intercept. So we started with an original function, that was our parent function, and we changed the slope to a 1/2 and the y-intercept to a plus 6. So in this one, we've got 2 things going on. We have a change in the slope. So a slope change, it makes it steeper or less steep. It was 1x, that was my original function. X is the same as 1x. So if it was a 1x and now it's a 1/2, it became smaller. It was 1 and now it's only 1/2. That's smaller. So this became less steep. So the slope got smaller, so my line became less steep. The slope number is with the x. So the slope number from the x got smaller, so it became less steep. Then there's a y-intercept, my number in the back. My y-intercept was 0. There was nothing in the back, but now it's a plus 6. So that means that this graph plus means it went up 6 units. So there were 2 things that happened here. It became less steep and it went up 6 units. So go ahead and try the same thing with number 6. Very difficult question there. See what you get there. All right, looking at number 7. In number 7, same idea. it asks it just a little bit differently. So number 7, it says that we have two functions that are given. How does the graph of f compare to the graph of g? So we need to look at this and see what's happening. So in f, we had a slope of 1/2, and we had a y-intercept of 7. In our next function, g, we had a slope of 5x, but our y-intercept, the number in the back, is still a 7. So this number in the back did not change. That's the same. So the number in the back does not move up or down because it didn't change. It was just a 7, and it's still a 7. So the thing that changed is the slope. So our slope is what changed. That's what I can see, the slope changed. So if the slope changed, let's look at our rules. If the slope gets bigger, it becomes steeper. If the slope gets smaller, it becomes less steep. What happened here? Our slope was 1/2, and in the second one, in the new one, it's a 5. That slope definitely got bigger from 1/2 to a positive 5. So this slope is bigger. So when the slope gets bigger, my answer is steeper. So my line became steeper. The y-intercept didn't change. It didn't move up or down, but the slope became steeper. So try the same idea for number 8. So that one there, the slope doesn't change, but the back number changes. So make sure you have these rules written down. A number with the x, like a 2x or a 1/2x. A number with the x changes the slope. If that number became bigger, it's steeper. If that number got smaller, your line is less steep. So we are comparing, looking at the slope, if it's steeper or less steep. If there's a number in the back, a plus would means it goes up. So like +4 means it goes up 4. A minus means it moves down. So -3 means it moves down 3. Okay, so number 7, very easy. Slope got bigger, so my line got steeper. The back number did not change, so it did not move up or down. It was at 7, and it's still at 7, so it did not move up or down. The slope became steeper. That's the only thing that happened here. Okay, so let's go ahead and flip over to the back.